Yeah, I've been watching The Growing Pains since 1972.
I imagine.
Where were you in 1972?
I was very young. I was born in 1964, so I was
64.
Yeah, and I started reading Ayn Rand when I was 13, so a couple years after that.
And who got you interested?
A band called Rush. Dr. Paul, thanks for having me. This is a real honor to be here in your enclave here in Lake Jackson. And I wanted to start with a story that everybody knows about some of your positions, but I think some of your sort of intellectual history and how you discovered the ideas, particularly of Austrian economics, is maybe something that some people don't know about. And I think it's important because you turned on so many young people to names like Mises and Rand and Hayek and Rothbard. How did you find these ideas?
Well, I don't have one precise moment or a precise person, but I think all of us, and it would include you or anybody who gets to the libertarian message, I think we're born with a curiosity instinct that, and somebody might perk it up a little bit, but I went through college interested, but a little bit confused. I was studying economics and all, and then I guess it was Goldwater period, and reading about him, and he would mention Austrian economics, and then it dawned on me that what I was seeking to do was to replace everything I was taught officially and what I was listening to. I had to get rid of that education and get a new education. So in the early years, it was probably probably the first significant book was Hayek, Road to Serfdom, and then one would lead to another. But I think the factor that's important is curiosity. I'm still very curious on how to understand things, how to explain things, and how to promote the ideas. But some people never get curious, and probably never will. I think the large majority of people never get really curious, and but they then are generally just going along with the status quo and the majority opinion. You can see it today. I don't happen to believe that all these people out on the streets are Marxists, but there's a way you can relate to that because there's leadership there that believe in it. But I work on that assumption. So it's the elite few that I'm interested in talking to with my activities, people that are curious enough to come and look. I was influenced a whole lot with Leonard Read, and Leonard Read was good on education, and he said that's the most important thing you do is get self-educated and not worry about where you're going to be next year, the year after, because if you know what you're talking about and people are comfortable with you, they'll find you. It's sort of the old issue of the remnant is out there, and if you represent something, people will come. And the most delight I had in that regard was when occasionally, it had to be occasionally, a congressman would come and they say, I've been watching your vote. It's strange. You vote with liberals, you vote with conservatives, and tell me more about this. And then they would modify their viewpoint. So, but that's not the way it works. The Congress is a reflection of the status quo of the educational system. You know all that.
So Leonard Read at the Foundation for Economic Education, I think he was the first free market think tank, certainly in the United States, but he was a retailer of ideas. He wasn't really interested in having sort of esoteric academic conversations. He had this beautiful metaphor of lighting a light and seeing if people would come to it. And I think it's interesting. You mentioned the trending of Marxism in the United States, but your first book was Hayek's most popular work. It was short. It was sweet. The Road to Serfdom was a grippy title, and it was almost a pop culture thing. It's a serious book, but it was a pop culture thing back when there was no other version of that story being told in the popular culture. Mm-hmm. That's got to be part of the story here, and to fast forward, there was a guy that influenced both of us, Dr. Hans Sennholz. Mm-hmm. I was a student at Grove City College, And I had already found Ludwig von Mises in high school because Ayn Rand, in one of her nonfiction books, says if you actually want to understand economics, you got to read Mises. And accidentally, I went to Grove City College to discover that there was actually a full-fledged Austrian economics program. Did you find Dr. Sennholz through FEE?
No, but I worked with him a lot in FEE, and he was a chairman there before he was chairman. I was chairman for a short while for FEE. But no, it was through the monetary issue.
Yeah.
See, I quite frequently mention that my real enlightenment came in 1971. Because the Austrians in the 60s, I was reading in this, and they said this can't work, and there's going to be a big deal coming, and there's going to be a devaluation, and it was artificially, gold was controlled at $35 an ounce. So I was very much into the monetary issue, and still am, because I see it as being a universal event for everything we want to do, because you have to pay for it, and it represents so much evil as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
So because of that, I came across anybody that would write about gold, get on newsletter, and one newsletter that I got involved in was the gold bug from New Orleans. That's terrible. I'm slipping on. Anyway, he had a conference. It was the first conference, probably 1971 or something.
Yeah.
And Jim Blanchard, he was very well known. I give him credit for getting gold re-legalized. He had a committee called National Committee to legalize gold. So I went there. Jim had his first conference very early in the 70s, probably right after the Bretton Woods broke down. And I remember taking the time off and flying over to New Orleans. But the economist he had there was Hans Sennholz. So that's where I met him and talked to him, and we stayed in touch a lot after that. And he was somebody I got to know where if I was still studying but didn't have a teacher in a classroom to ask questions, I would call him up. He'd explain things. He was just great. He was from Pennsylvania, and I was from Pennsylvania. So, and of course, I've been to that campus quite a few times. But Sennholz was, he had a lot of influence on me, probably out of proportion to, say, the books that Mises has written or Rothbard had written, because he was a teacher and it was practical, and he was a friend, but he was the first one. Of course, Leonard Read was a teacher in that category, but then I was led into meeting the various ones, whether it was Rothbard, Mises, and Hayek, and Friedman, not an Austrian, but also a free market person, and that always was an encouragement to me.
Yeah, you know this, and I don't know if you knew it at the time, but when you were running for president, you would drop these names, Hayek and Mises and all that, and you had a generation of young people who had never heard of Austrian economics or young people, but they did, because of you, what you did in terms of re-educating yourself and replacing formal education, which doesn't teach you about any of this stuff. With these ideas, and Sennholz in particular, he focused on the manipulation of money and credit and inflation and debt, and he was a practical guy. He was focused on the actual impact that these things had, but the Austrians have a different view on this stuff, and I thought we might dig in a little bit so that people understand why the Austrian perspective actually is a good framework to figure out all this crazy stuff that's going on in the world today. Because I think Mises' first work was on money, and the origins of money, and he got it from the founder Carl Menger, and he very much worried about central planning and money as creating bad signals and all of that. What is the Austrian take on money that's different than the kind of economics you would get in college?
I'll answer that, but it reminds me of the story somebody told me that when he got married to Margaret, and he said, I wanted to tell you something. He says, I will be talking, and you're going to hear a lot about money, but you're never going to have a lot of it because he wasn't in the investment business. He wasn't going to do that.
Trying to save money wasn't a lucrative business.
Now, your question is what's particularly about the Austrian school and
what's
money?
the Austrian take on money that leads you to think about things against fiat currency and for the gold standard?
It was the introduction to this understanding that it was all wrong during the 60s and before, and the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. All this stuff was just misled. I see it, probably the biggest issue is the moral issue of it, because it's equivalent to counterfeiting. It's official counterfeiting, and that can't be good. You can't do that. And then the next step, well, what does the Constitution say? Oh, it says you're not allowed to do that. Yeah. So it's a constitutional issue. Then you say, what about the economic issue? Doesn't it help a lot of people? And no, it helps them for a while, and then they suffer, and one group gets benefit, the other group don't. And then especially I liked the understanding, which I've come to believe is the correct viewpoint, and that is that the distribution of wealth becomes distorted, and then we have the answer to the Marxists, because they use today's economy. Oh, those free market people. So you and I get thrown in that thing, that, oh yeah, look at it. You have the super wealthy and the poor getting poorer. Then there's a bailout, and the rich get bailed out, no matter how hard they pretend they're going to help the common man. Because even if they help them, that lasts a week and they're back to it.
Yeah.
So I think that was a big issue for me, because it was after I was practicing medicine. I was very busy in the early 70s, and then when the Bretton Woods broke down, that was a strong message. It was during that period of time before I had decided to run for anything. Is that I heard I read in our newspapers, very, very little clip in our local, the Houston newspaper, and it said that von Mises was going to give a lecture at the University of Houston on such and such day. And I thought, boy, I'd like to go and meet him and hear his lecture and all. And so there was only one person I could call that I knew that would know who Mises was. So there was another doctor. So he and I took the afternoon off from our medical practice, drove up to Houston. We heard him give the lecture on socialism. Yeah. So, but it was then I got to the point where I wanted to talk out. I wanted to, somebody needed to know this. So nobody teaches this, nobody talks about it. And the more I studied, the more significant. You mean that's the only way you can finance the welfare state? What if you don't need welfare? Well, get rid of the Fed. What if you think we get into too many wars? Well, how do you think wars are financed? And it boils down to the destruction of money, the moral principle of counterfeiting money and serving the powerful special interests. So that to me was very attractive. So if you allowed it to exist, the libertarian message exists to that, and you can talk to progressives.
Yeah.
And frequently I had good friends that were progressives, that we would talk about this, and I've never come around to agreeing on the economic things, but no. And then in 1974, it was in 73 I decided, well, that was a Watergate mess going on. Yeah. At that time there were three members of the delegation in Texas that were Republican. Everything else was Democrat. And it was Watergate year, and nobody was going to run in 74. The district I lived in was Democrat. For one guy, had it for 25 years. So I said, well, I'll just run for office. I went and talked to, I was going to do it as an independent. The Republicans heard that. No, why don't you run as a Republican? We'll let you sacrifice yourself. Yeah. Okay, I'll do that. So that got me into doing it. But so I tell the story. You probably heard it. It's pretty boring. That I was practicing medicine. I was very busy, but now I had this thing been torn between what I really thought was important, what I really enjoyed and I thought was important. So I told my wife, I said, I think I'm going to run for Congress. And she said, what in the world? Because she saw family, kids, little kids. Rand was pretty small. We had 5 kids, and I had a good practice. And she said, what are you going to do that for? I said, I just want to talk about this. I won't mind too much, because I want to just to express my views. And she said, that's a dangerous thing to do. And I thought, is she into conspiracies or not? No, no, that wasn't it. She said that you'll probably, no, she said, you'll win and disrupt our lives, you know. And I guaranteed her that. That's not going to happen. No, nobody knows what I'm talking about. Nobody really cares what I talk about. And it's a district that's never been Republican, and I don't have any money. And she said, yeah, but you'll be telling the truth, and they'll like that.
Yeah.
You know, which is something that came back many years. A lot of people voted for me, put me in office because they said, well, at least we know you're telling the truth, which is, I guess, nobody in politics, you don't do that. So it was a strange way to accidentally fall on a good theme.
Yeah.
So, but I didn't win in 74, but immediately afterwards, I think the guy that was ready to retire, and he saw maybe a little bit of a threat that I'd be back the next year, so he resigned. And there was a special election, unusual circumstances. And that's one thing about politics. Sometimes it's luck, and I couldn't have planned any of that. If he hadn't resigned, I'd have never gone to Congress. If the Bretton Woods hadn't existed, I'd have never gone to Congress. I had no desire to go to Congress or be in Congress. You know, I was there long enough that you'd think a successful politician, after being there 22 years, you'd think you'd have been chairman of the banking committee. But I think you know how the system works. And it doesn't work that way. Seniority is, if you play the game, raise the money, feed it to the parties, vote the way they tell you. That's not what I'm into it for. So, but I had my chance, and then there was a special election, and that was a real surprise. You know, I actually ended up winning it. So, but I was in and out of office. I stayed there 6-7 years, and I said I want to go back to medicine. It wasn't. I'm not cut out for this. And by 96. You know, I got pressured into it and said, why don't you do it again? Do this again. Look, the Republicans just took over the House. You know, maybe they're better now. Oh, maybe. I said, yeah, but think of the baggage now. I had run as a libertarian, strongly opposed, the drug war. I mean, I think that's really evil. I think drugs are evil too, but the drug war. I said that's just.
Most Americans have caught up with you on that.
Yeah, that's right. Now. I think libertarians sort of won that.
Yeah.
But I said I can't win. But I'm in the Bible Belt. And here I'm talking about legalizing marijuana. And of course, I was always able to say, I said, yes, I am. I saw to tell you the truth. I've never ever seen a person smoke marijuana. I was pretty much removed from that. But I was I think, an ideal person to start talking about it, because it was on principles of liberty, and it was also coming from a doctor that didn't like drugs. So. But I remember my first press conference, because it extended up into Houston. So the press conference was held in Houston because there was better media. And I thought, this thing won't work, So I had the press conference. I can remember the very first question, the aggressive reporter, one was there with the Houston Chronicle. He hit me hard on the drug issue. And I said, I knew this. But I just gave him my answer, and it was, people never really held it against me. My suspicion was that even back then, where it was, people knew something was wrong, the politician knew it was something wrong, but boy, they were so intimidated. They would never vote just a token little, maybe we shouldn't put him in prison for 20 years. Oh, reduce it to 10. Oh no, we can't do that. We got to be tough on crime, drug crime. So that was. I think the people were way ahead. I think you indicated way ahead of this issue, and I think that's why it finally came around.
Maybe people had never heard the sort of principled liberty argument as to why people should be free to make those choices and
make them more comfortable,
and how government can create perverse incentives that destroys lives. But you said something earlier that I think is pretty fundamental, and I try to tell this to people that are aspiring to political office, and they have the right values. But there's something about politics that the consultants tell you, don't tell the truth, don't say what's on your mind. You can't say that because people won't elect you. But you broke that rule by just going out and being yourself. And so why isn't that, like, why don't more people learn that lesson about you, that you can actually be successful communicating to people if you're authentic and you're real and you have a set of principles?
I think about that. I get questions on that in general, but never totally resolved of why. But maybe my wife had it. Maybe people are starved for hearing the truth, and they believe what I was saying. So it was my earnestness that did it. But why didn't more people come that way and look at it as a economic or a political benefit? They're slow learners. Now they went. Can you imagine anybody campaigning now? They want tougher laws on marijuana. So they're not going to do that. That's a matter of fact. That's a big deal going on how to handle it, because I've done programs where I've expressed my disdain about the militarization of the police.
Yeah.
At the same time, it's not without sympathy when I think about freeing up 10,000 violent criminals and then defunding the police. That's not my position.
Yeah. Well, it's and people get confused about this, and you always get this false choice in modern politics where you either are for all of the laws that put young people in jail for nonviolent drug offenses, or you want to defund the police. And it's like neither of those is the correct position. The correct position is, why don't we start by decriminalizing and making not illegal all of this stuff that's not actually a crime. If you didn't hurt anybody, what's the crime? And that of course is a classic libertarian position.
Legalize freedom. What a radical thought.
Yeah.
But I spent a lot of time on that during the presidential races on the college campuses, that what it means to have control of your own life.
Yeah.
It's not an endorsement of doing dumb things.
Right.
But we don't make it illegal, but, and I always made a big point, but if you have that right to your life and that you own it and you can go and do it and you do dumb things and you screw up, you can't go to the government to get bailed out.
Right.
And usually I would get a good applause on that. It was a responsibility.
Yeah.
And but that's pretty removed from what a dedicated progressive would think. Oh,
Right.
we got to protect them, you know.
Yeah, like liberty is a responsibility, and I feel like sometimes libertarians don't tell that side of the story, that civil society and communities and families and churches and that whole infrastructure that Hayek writes a lot about, the social institutions that hold society together, that's the real social safety net. So if you make a mistake, you probably are going to get some tough love from your family and your local church, but it's not a bailout, and it's not a safety net in the sense that you will not be held accountable for your own actions.
I think being a physician helped me on the drug issue, because I would usually tell them I think they're dangerous, you shouldn't use them. But then I had this other political position, and when I ran in that first race, it was a Democratic district, and then he resigned. The Republicans then remembered me. I don't know if you know any of this story or not, but the Republicans remembered me, and they thought, we can't let this happen.
Yeah. So
they got Laughlin was the congressman. Actually, he turned out to be a friend and a nice guy, but he turned to his Republican. They put him on Ways and Means, and Gingrich raised money, and congressmen, dozens and dozens of congressmen, both our senators, our governors, endorsed my opponent. They had to keep a Republican seat. When I went up, before they had switched that, I went to the Republican luncheon, because by that time there weren't 3, there were about 15 Republicans. And I said, I was trying to be generous. I said, I can help. I can make, if I'm going to run, I said, but I can help make this a Democratic, a Republican seat.
Yeah.
And I said, I never realized how quickly I did that. 2 weeks later, it was a Republican seat because they got him to switch.
Yeah.
But it was a very, very interesting. He had so many endorsements, political endorsements. But I don't know if you know the story, but I had one, Nolan Ryan. Nolan Ryan's endorsement carried the weight.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. But I think that the Republicans were gunning for me because what I wanted to say was the Republicans. Just when I was running against another, I had to win a primary. Then I had to beat the incumbent. First before I went after the Democrat. So they used the drug issue. They spent, back then, $1 million was a lot of money to spend on this, just on the drug issue, that I was crazy and destroying kids and looking at the babies, and it was the ugliest, meanest thing. And so I knew it would happen. I was very stoic about the whole thing. So with an ad person, we worked out something that I put a white coat on and held a newborn. And it was very, very bland, bland but powerful enough.
Yeah.
And most people, so many people knew me anyway. That I had delivered thousands of babies, and they painted me so badly. So you'd think so I was able to beat the Republican, went into the the major election, the general election. The Democrats did the same thing, spent all their money on this idiot who thinks you should legalize drugs, and they painted it in the worst thing. So I got a big charge out of that. I thought the strength of the message, the strength of putting out there, has a lot of value.
It's fascinating. And I'm thinking about something you said earlier. That a lot of your views were attractive to progressives, honest progressives that were thinking about the redistribution of wealth through the Federal Reserve. And it kind of goes back to Mises' critique of the business cycle, like that those injections of easy money and credit, they don't land equally across the economy. They fall in the laps of the well-to-do and the connected, the insiders, if you will. So there's sort of a progressive populist critique of the Fed. Same with the drug war. The drug war puts a lot of black and brown kids in jail for nonviolent behavior. There's a progressive argument for that, but there's also a freedom argument for that. But it seems like both the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment, based on the story you just told, they spend all of their time fighting you and the liberty message. What are they afraid of?
Well, you'd wonder, but they did it, and it didn't work very well. So more they yelled and screamed, but that was a challenge, and I really deep down didn't care if I won or not. So that wasn't my goal.
That's why you were bulletproof, because you weren't looking for power.
Yeah, and they said, well, how do you handle lobbyists? Don't they put pressure on you? No, I never see them. They just knew where I stood. And Gingrich at one time made a statement. He was speaker, and I would go occasionally, not often, but I would go occasionally in the early years of attending the conference. And he was in a tight fight to get enough votes. And he came in here, and he says, we are going to do this. You guys get everything you want. Everybody has something in there, and you're going to vote for this bill, this budget. He says, except Ron Paul, he doesn't have to. He said that, and I said, well, they leave you alone after a bit.
Like if they hold the chairmanship against you, they will cut off your funding. But at that point, you were untouchable because you had sort of beat their well-funded candidate.
Yeah, and the chairmanship, See, the conditions aren't right. I need more people like you out there doing more stuff to get the consensus. because even being president, what can you do? You know, Trump tries at times, but then he really gets clobbered. I think his instincts, he wants to do this, but all of a sudden, the pressures get pretty great. So and that's why I think politics is so secondary to it. I think it's changing people's mind, have something they believe in, something that they understand and feel good that it's an American tradition, and that you can argue with liberals that there is a consensus, that it helps the poor people. You want to protect the middle class, you got to listen to us, and that I think is a big help, and that's the reason that I became very good friends with Dennis Kucinich. He's honest progressive, and we didn't talk economics.
Yeah.
But he came around to strong supporting me on Federal Reserve, and sometimes he and I were the only ones voting for non-interventionist foreign policy. So he was very good. And I was thinking about the other day there was an announcement that some troops were going to leave Germany. Not exactly my method, but they were going to leave. It looked like they might be going to Poland.
Yeah.
So it didn't fit the idea of a non-interventionist thing. So, but it reminded me that over the years, Barney Frank, I got along with him better than the Republican chairman of the banking committee.
Yeah.
That he would come, and he was interested in the subject of bringing troops home from Europe. From a very liberal viewpoint, but never rearranging things. He just thought, save some money. Progressives sometimes say, save the money, we'll spend it on the poor. That's how we'll help. So anyway, I would always co-sponsor it. And I thought of that the other day, that one of the things we were going to get the troops out of Germany, and that's exactly what we tried to do, but maybe we helped this much.
There is, and I'll ask you at some point if you have any really juicy, embarrassing stories about young Rand Paul, because you mentioned him earlier, but I'm joking. I'm not. We'll do that off the record. But one of the things of the current generation, not just your son Rand Paul, but I would put Mike Lee in this category, Thomas Massey, Justin Amash although he's no longer a Republican, but he has traditionally found lots of lucrative partnerships with people on the sort of far left of the Democratic caucus, on surveillance, on war, on crony capitalism, on the drug war, and these are all things that you were fighting that fight very lonely back in the day.
Yeah, and I like I say, I just don't have high expectations. Like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to save the world. Mine is very, very modest approach. My goal is to understand the bill, to understand the issue, understand it and explain it, and plant a seed here and there. So it wasn't so much how far we would get.
Yeah.
The coalitions I would, just for strategic and educational reasons, to help explain to people that we do have the message to bring people together. It's I think, and that probably I convey that with the young people, because when I go to a campus, the average talk would be an hour or so, and I never had to worry about a clock, and I would talk, but I would be very enthusiastic. But probably 45 minutes was just saying, this place is really messed up.
Yeah.
Look at the budget. Look at these wars. How many people have died? Look at the loss of personal liberty. Just go on and on. And then the last 10 minutes, I would get on to, well, what do you do about it? And that's when I would get really excited and say how positive it is. It's not complicated, and anybody can understand it. And I guess on several occasions, somebody afterwards came up to me and they say, why I like listening to you? Because you're so optimistic. I said, optimistic? 45 minutes, I told you it was the end of the world.
Yeah.
But I think the first part is you gain credibility. You're telling the truth. And the people know there's a problem out there. You're not denying it. And then you come up with a philosophy, which is they should feel safe because it's very positive, it's pro-American, it's pro-legal, it's moral, it's constitutional, and it doesn't take much.
Yeah.
It doesn't take much. It's so great that you can do this. doesn't cost any money. You end up being wealthier under these conditions. So, but I always like the last 10 minutes to be more than the other part.
Well, you're also putting the power back into the hands of the audience. Like this, you can do this. You don't need someone to go to Washington, D.C. You can take your lives and your liberties and your country back from these insiders. You ran for office many times, and particularly your presidential campaigns. Did you know that you were kind of doing what Hayek was doing, in that it was a soapbox for cultural change as opposed to an insider position where you were going to pass legislation from the inside?
Yes, but I don't know whether I'd have to have a precise definition of cultural. If things were better, economic.
Well, turning on young people to the ideas is what I mean by that.
I remember one time, and this will bring up Sennholz, Leonard Reed would teach, study, learn it, understand it, and if you're worth your salt, they will come. They'll seek you out, and it's not like you have to go and beg and plead to give the message, but they will come. One time, I wrote a paper, gave a little speech, and it was popular, and Sennholz wrote me, or we talked, and he said something, well, that was very good. He came up and he said, I think I concluded and made the point that you don't push too hard. That was Leonard's idea.
Yeah.
Don't push too hard, and you tell them when they ask you. And I was delighted when somebody would, like a member of Congress, somebody could sit down and ask me. And Sennholz wrote and said, "No, tell them you're a teacher." So he brought up the subject. I know he was trying to sort out what I was. He says, "You're not into politics. You're a teacher, but you tell them."
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting. So it was a compliment coming from somebody I admired.
So I have this theory that I tell people, and I'll test it on you. Sometimes people are shocked and offended by this, but at a very superficial level, I compare you and the Ron Paul revolution to the Bernie Sanders revolution, and I'll explain that before you get offended by it, because at a superficial level, you guys, first of all, you're both authentic, and you're always the same person that you always were, and he was always a socialist. But his stump speech was railing about permanent war, railing about crony capitalism, railing about the drug war and mass incarceration. His solutions were to expand government, but I think at a certain level, he was probably turning on the next generation of people just like you were. Do you buy that, or is that crazy?
Yeah, I think the first half is perfect. That's what we were doing. But then when it came for that last 15-minute speech, that was totally foreign to him.
Socialize everything.
But he was preparing for it. But I would say that my last 15 minutes and his last 15 minutes, I would like to think that I was in a happier frame of mind.
Yeah.
But no, I think it is that way. But he has a different end goal, and but in the meantime, to get there. But I think so many. I don't know exactly where Bernie would be on this, but we want to get out of Europe mainly because we want more money for the welfare beneficiaries. They don't understand the basic economics.
Yeah.
So you and I can talk about this because we sort of have a good understanding of why sound money and limited governments and balanced budget is actually a benefit to people, but they don't understand that. But I think the appeal is such, and he has an advantage, and a powerful advantage, is because without somebody shouting our message out there as the alternative, the message always comes from the university professors. Oh yeah, that's exactly what my professor says, and this is what we have to do, and what do you need, this and that, so they do it. But a person like Bernie, we worked, not always to my satisfaction, but he would come across as being anti-Fed, but it was less the way they were intervening rather than understanding the money issue.
Yeah, he was flirting with substance, but he ended up backing off on that, as I recall. Let's pivot to current events, because I want to take these principles and try to explain some of it's all bad. All the headlines are bad right now. You know this. Like the government seems to be hell bent on screwing everything up. And I want to ask this first question because you were on the inside, and you've been trying to get us out of permanent war since the day you went to Washington D.C. Barack Obama ran on getting us out of Afghanistan and Iraq and getting us out of the wars. Donald Trump ran on getting us out of Afghanistan and Iraq, but it doesn't ever seem to happen. Why can't we get this done?
Military-industrial complex is very powerful. The deep state runs things, but Obama actually campaigned on the issue, Iraq's a bad war, but Afghanistan is the good war. So he promised that he would be involved there, and he was only trying to win over some of our people because he and Hillary were terrible on Syria and Libya, and even though his rhetoric would be the same. No, I think Trump probably would be a better non-interventionist, but he's not going to be a fighter if it comes down to self-destructing. It's the power of the deep state, and they are very powerful. And I sometimes think, well, when I'm not happy with Trump, he's doing this anyway, why doesn't he just bring the troops home? Why is he going to send them to Poland? I think that's a dangerous thing to do. Yeah. And I will say to myself, he probably has had the least amount of body bags than any president in the last 20 years or so. They're being killed, but we don't have. That's a pretty gross way of measuring things, but it does tell us a little bit. I think he wants to avoid the conflict, but he's also willing to use the CIA and do that and violate the methods. I think in some way. I've never talked about this, but somebody would have to research to laugh at me or something. But I think his foreign policy is a little bit like Eisenhower's foreign policy. And Eisenhower's the one that says, the military-industrial complex. But Eisenhower was terrible. What was the first thing he did? He used the CIA for the overthrow of the Iranian government, and he did that. But anytime there was an emergency, in Europe, where the Russians, the Soviets were moving, he never sent troops in. I remember in '76, I thought there was the Suez Crisis. The British and the French were trying to save the canal, and a big thing. They're going to be talking to Eisenhower. They're going to come down here and help us out. And it's '76 wasn't that many years from the the Korean War. I thought, I'm going to be drafted. But in about 2 days it was over. Eisenhower said, forget it. So I think of him like a Trump.
Yeah.
But he's not afraid of, because he was a strong endorser of the Dulles brothers. And the Dulles brothers weren't exactly libertarian. They were very authoritarian, and there's a lot of shenanigans going on, especially Allen Dulles. Yeah. I don't know where you stand on that, but I think he was not a good person.
Yeah. Well, my knee-jerk reaction to almost any politician is probably wasn't a good person, but present company excepted, of course. Like Trump is like he's like a ball of contradictions on this stuff, because he complains about the deep state and clearly
and hires him.
Yeah, and then hires John Bolton, and he surrounds himself with neocons, and when he has an opportunity to do something about mass surveillance, he does the opposite. Is that because, it's not just the people that he nominates, but the machine? He's surrounded by these people. Does he seems aware of who they are, but is he not willing to take it on?
Probably, that's it. Daniel and I on Liberty Report, we talk about a lot, why. He says this but does this, and anytime he says something that we like, we praise him, and sometimes there's an act that we'll praise, but then we also say, well, why did he hire this guy? Why does he hire Elliot Abrams? And this kind of thing. Yeah. So it's once again, if Eisenhower truly didn't believe in all this shenanigans and CIA overthrows and militarism in a different manner than sending in the troops. If he didn't believe in it, why did he have high praise for it?
Yeah.
And Cuba was, Eisenhower helped set up that fiasco. So, which now Kennedy, I think was, I mean, he got better as he went on because he accelerated the war over there in Vietnam, but he was the one that was going to close down the war in Cuba, and I really believe that's connected to his assassination.
Yeah.
And of course the war with the Kennedys and the CIA was ongoing for a long time. I think that's probably one of the biggest issues that I mull over in my mind and try to write about, and that is the control of our government, the deep state, who really wields the power, and evidently there's not the people we elect. I mean, the elections. It's a farce.
Yeah.
Then they say, "What were you doing there? What do you do? You were there." Well, I don't know how that happened. It was a fluke.
This is one of the contradictions of progressivism and maybe democratic socialism, is that like one of the progressive dreams was to make a permanent class of bureaucrats who could not be fired, because they were going to be smarter than the rest of us and sort of design things from the top down. But it gets to one of these issues that there is sort of a left libertarian consensus on crony capitalism, because you said that war is big business, and the big business and all the people that produce the weapons of the war machine are very much together with this idea that we should be in more wars. This happens again and again, and I feel like there should be an acknowledgement from progressives that if you can't fire people, you can't hold them accountable, but they don't seem to appreciate that.
I had some more recent thoughts about that, because when you read in the paper today and people ask, why is big business sending money to help Black Lives Matter and the Marxist system that's going on there? Why do they give it to the universities? They're the real culprits. But then there's big business channeling millions and millions of dollars into it. Isn't that a contradiction?
Yeah.
And I got to thinking, that used to really, I didn't understand what was going on. And that was, we'd read stories about World War II. Don't you know that the businessman supported Hitler? Now, I don't know if that's really true. Yeah. So it probably was, and it was big money. I think they think that if these non-freedom lovers, but they're so-called the crony capitalists, they know that power is going to exist, and they will get in and they will support a Marxist movement, and they will divvy up the loot.
Yeah.
As long as they're. I think, in that sense, fascism to me is more dangerous than a principled communist who believes that it's designed to forcibly redistribute the wealth instead of saying that we're going to have business ownership and they're going to be partners with government. I hate that when they say that we're going to be partners with the government, and that's not my idea of a proper political system.
Yeah, like fascism is government control of the means of productions.
Yeah, they don't have ownership, but they're really in charge.
So it's like politics and
contracts.
Yeah, contracts and all of that stuff. And so like it. And when I see businesses with their Black Lives Matter banners and it looks like tribute and payoff in hopes that they won't come after them. Mm-hmm. But eventually they'll come after them as well.
The recent bill they're arguing over in Washington, the next $1 trillion or so, they're gonna, the Defense Department is going to get $29 billion.
Yeah.
And buy weaponries and refurbish things, $29 billion. That used to be a lot of money, but that's just peanuts when they do a trillion. And then what people say, Well, isn't what Trump does? He just has these executive orders. Isn't that unconstitutional? Yeah, well, the whole system is unconstitutional. But what about the money that churns out there in the bailouts from the Federal Reserve?
Yeah,
that's what they do in the Congress. Peanuts.
Yeah.
Compared to Fed dealt with, even in 08 and 09, estimates were probably over $15 trillion bailing out their friends to secure the system. And they're, I think, very much involved in that right now again.
Yeah, so going back to my professor, Hans Sennholz, he argued essentially that there's 4 ways to spend money you don't have. You can raise taxes, you can borrow, 3 ways, and you can borrow, and there's only so much taxes you can raise because people will revolt. There's only so much you can borrow because eventually people won't loan you money anymore. And the third option is the most pernicious. We're gonna print money and expand credit, and that's what they're doing right now. This the $3 trillion they just spent, it's like insane. I guess it was $2 trillion. It's trillions are now rounding errors on the money they want to spend, but so much of it is being done through the Fed and manipulating, deciding who wins and who loses. We're going to bail out this business, not that business. We've learned nothing. Nothing's changed. So it's a nice segue to the Corona lockdowns. Speaking of insanity, like here we are. We were supposed to have a couple weeks to flatten the curve back in March, and here we are in August in Texas of all places, and a lot of businesses can't open, and a lot of governors and mayors and politicians that I've never heard of are telling us in very minute detail how to live our lives. We have to wear masks, so we have to do this, we can't do that, and not inconsequentially, we just had the worst quarter of economic performance, I think, in the history of the United States. Yeah. And people are surprised. They mandated that businesses not serve customers. They mandated that customers not go out. And here we have this quarter. Is there a method to their madness here? Why are we doing this to ourselves?
Well, I think that long-term Marxism depends on chaos and disruption, and they'll pick up the pieces. So yes, a lot of that is that way. But the Marxists, I think, know exactly what they're doing. So, but I think the the one thing that I work hard with on my program is trying to distinguish sort out the problems. You know, Black Lives Matter, demonstrations against masks and pro-mask, anti-mask, and also the financial bubble of the Federal Reserve. And people don't know it, but this all started with the bubble bursting. The financial bubble actually had bursted, before the coronavirus. I believe the coronavirus was overemphasized on purpose because it's not as deadly as influenza and different pneumonia. There's so many statistics to show that it is just exaggerated, and there was a lot of building of fear and hysteria, and people are so intimidated, power that they wanted. So that has been the problem. So we had but I think the Fed distortion, the debt and the malinvestment, you've got to eliminate that in order to get back to real growth. All they can do now is print more money, which dilutes wealth, and it doesn't work. Distortion of interest rates, It's not supposed to help us. So we don't even have interest rates. So that has all led to it, and set the stage for Black Lives Matter coming in and to grab up on the pieces. But and it distracts, excuse me, it distracts from the Federal Reserve being a big part of this. One of the real culprits. Nobody talks about the Federal Reserve causing all this. We can't spend anything.
Yeah.
Without the Federal Reserve, and nobody really pays much attention to it.
Do you think that masks work?
Masks?
Yeah.
Well,
you're a doctor.
I can't say no, never.
Yeah.
I think what they're doing now is useless and dangerous. I think there's good studies to show that if you're measuring If you put a mask on and start measuring the oxygen content of what's in your mouth and the CO2 goes up, oxygen goes down. And today we reported on the program of masked people make them sick. The dentists are inundated now with people coming in because gums are getting worse and they have mouth odors and they're looking for what's going on here. I think it's a disease part of the mask, but I don't think for a minute. I believe that the Swedes had it right, the Danish have it right, and some of those European countries have it. I think South Dakota has it right, and they're accepting a more natural way, natural immunity and herd immunity. It's real, and once they try to string this out and flatten the curve, they don't change anything. But it is, most people say, oh, you don't think people are sick. No, I think they're very sick. That's why we ought to have better medical care for them.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, we put them on respirators as soon as we can. Yeah, it turns out respirators weren't the best thing to do it. Well, yeah, we have sick people here. What do we do? Well, we'll force them into a nursing home where everybody dies. I mean, it's all government mismanaged. I've talked a lot about this since this came up because we know about separation of church and state. And of course, we had good libertarians said we should have separation of church and school. And I think we should have separation of medicine and the state. They shouldn't be in the practice of medicine. This whole thing that they can make these dictations and tell people what to do. Yeah. I've worn a lot of masks, temporarily when I'm doing surgery and all. But this whole idea of making kids wear those masks, and it's really, and today we cited an example of one, I think she was in Tennessee, like a board member of a city, and she said, anybody that wears a mask should be charged with murder, or attempted murder. And then you wonder why.
Does or doesn't?
No. If they don't wear it, they're potential murderers, and they should be arrested for that. And that's why there's a lot of violence breaking out now. You mix that up with a person that's into it because of Black Lives Matter and Marxism. Boy, this is great stuff for them. But that's all completely wrong. I think that a libertarian approach to this would be quite a bit different, but some people would use a mask. I had a daughter not too long ago who was very ill, intensive care and all, and she didn't have a good immune system. I wore a mask. I mean, it isn't the wearing of the mask. It's the universal force of doing things by people who don't know what they're doing, and first, do no harm. But what they're doing is, first thing we do is do more harm so we have more things to do.
Yeah.
But no, it's very, very bad. I think that fortunately it looks like it's bygone, but they've already warned us. There'll be a new virus next year. And of course, I sort of detest the philosophy of Bill Gates and Fauci. They're not in our interest, I'll tell you that. And Gates for this immune system and taking these vaccines to trace us and all that. That's the worst kind of authoritarianism that you can think of.
Yeah, it's very 1984.
Yeah, scary.
And it strikes me that this whole idea that you would hide from a virus is sort of a medieval approach to medicine, combined with central planning. Guys like Governor Cuomo actually thought that he could second guess the entire medical profession, the entire science profession, and herd sick people into nursing homes, and it was a human tragedy. And it strikes me that perhaps Governor Cuomo should read a little bit of Ludwig von Mises.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to happen.
No, probably not.
Talk about what you're doing now, because I think there's the Ron Paul Liberty Report. You have every right to take it easy, but you just keep going because you think that there's the Ron Paul revolution is still brewing. What's going on?
Right. Well, I didn't do this on purpose. Well, I did it on purpose to talk about, like I did that first campaign when I was just going to talk a little bit about it and nothing's going to come of it. So I wanted this little studio for communications, and I would do it. But it turns out now under today's circumstances, I don't wear masks, so I can't go very far. And I'm not going to get on that airplane under these conditions. So all of a sudden, I don't give speeches anymore.
Yeah.
I don't go give speeches. I don't travel. I'm not going to get on those airplanes like that. I am not going to capitulate to what I think is a lot of evil out there. So I have my little studio, and Daniel McAdams is co-host on this. We do a lot of foreign policy, but we've talked a lot about coronavirus. It's a libertarian channel. We go live at 11 a.m. Central Time, 5 days out of the week. So I like that. It's I don't have to travel, and I still say a few words, you know, and the audiences are decent, but they're not huge. But the one thing I say, well, yeah, your numbers aren't like a big radio television station. I said, yeah, but we don't know how big it is. We don't know in the internet. Sometimes people pick up what you say and they spread it around. Yeah. So maybe there's a little bit of that. So no, I'm very much involved in that, which means I work hard at trying to keep up with the current events and trying to apply our philosophy to that and how to solve the problems and without violence.
Yeah, always without violence. So what you've been doing this a long time, and you've had, you've created social movements. What is the legacy of the Ron Paul revolution?
People ask me that, and I said, I don't know. It's up to somebody else. I mean, the thing that has excited me the most is when I'm talking to young people, or somebody a little older, maybe even a congressman, they come and they say, I want to know more about what makes you tick. That question that was told to me by Leonard, that's what you want. So that's what I enjoy the most. And I did get a lot of support from the young people. And some of them, boy, I bump into them, and they have their own organizations, and they are still speaking out. But you don't know. What I got the question frequently at the end of a speech. They say, "Okay, we're excited. Well, tell us what to do." And I said, "Do whatever you want," because I don't know what you're capable of doing. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. And some have been very creative, but I also emphasize the fact that you have to try to work at understanding things, because none of us are infallible and we don't always understand. And the more information we have, the better. And if you do that, you don't have to worry too much about your social activities, because you should have fun doing this. I mean, when I wanted to soften my stance at the college campuses, I said, but if there are groups of you and you get together, you should have a lot of fun. Back then, we were allowed to have fun.
Fun was still legal.
Now we can't even have our rallies. So you want to, and with like-minded, I'm sure you know about it because you talk to people that are interested in the philosophy. The people come together because they have a basic agreement, and we get to work on our conspiracy. How are we going to make things different the right kind of way?
Yeah.
So I think people should have fun. If I couldn't be involved, this, I didn't have my studio, and because before coronavirus, I would get a lot of interviews, a lot less now because of the way things are going. But it's something that I'm pleased that I'm able to do it here, and I didn't have a plan for it. I didn't know, I'm going to have this studio and all, but it just sort of came together.
It emerged spontaneously.
Yeah. Right.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. This has been a fun time.
Wonderful. Nice to have been with you.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.